I'm not hearing it. Live from the SABC's Auckland Park studios, welcome to this week's last edition of The Watchdog. My name is Vuyo Mvogo, and on the show tonight,
the Thabo Mbeki African School of Public and International Affairs, a joint initiative of the University of South Africa and the Thabo Mbeki Foundation, will on May 27 this year, 2022, host the 12th annual Thabo Mbeki Africa Day Lecture. The lecture will be themed the African Union at 20, to mark the 20th anniversary of the AU.
20 years after he hosted continental leaders in Durban for the launch of the African Union, Thabo Mbeki's foundation and their University of South Africa partners are pondering the question: is the AU living up to its lofty ambitions? My guests are Thabo Mbeki Foundation Chairperson Geraldine Mlegeti and UNISA's Professor Darlene Miller. And a day after the Monetary Policy Committee of the Reserve Bank got its fair share of criticism for aggressively hiking the repo rate, we look at whether Lesetja Kganyago and his team are also paying for the sins of those who are supposed to take care of the fiscal side of things. Well, tough times ahead for the South African working class as well as households and small businesses as inflation hits everyone's earnings. That's the message many people, said or communicated yesterday following, of course, that decision by the South African Reserve Bank's Monetary Policy Committee to hike the repo rate. Now, a day after that, today that is, Finance, Economic Development, as well as Public Enterprises ministers got chances to speak publicly about what's topmost in their minds. We will tell you what they had to say. We're talking here about Ibrahim Patel, Pravin Gordhan, as well as Enoch Godongwana. That will come, of course, before our guest for this evening, economist Pelisa Ngomo, weighs in on the issue. That's what's coming up in tonight's episode of The Watchdog, which starts now. Well, many South Africans are still reeling from the shock that of that aggressive 50 basis point rate hike that was announced yesterday by the Reserve Bank Governor, Lesetja Kganyago. And now, if you watched the program, you would have heard one of our panelists yesterday arguing why he has reservations about the Reserve Bank Monetary Policy Committee's decision to hike, the rate by 50 basis points. It was an aggressive move, according to our guest last night, Professor Ngepa. Take a listen to what he told us yesterday.
When we look at the whole spectrum of things, and we have to strike a balance to ask ourselves, when we are living in a society like South Africa where half of the population is below the poverty line, but at the same time there is high levels of inequality, you ask yourself, to who is the benefit of high interest rates? High interest rate, of course, benefits the owners of capital, because immediately you raise interest rates, capital becomes more expensive, and the owners of capital are the ones who benefit. In my view, without any research yet to point to any authoritative research, it is very clear that a more tighter monetary policy, as much as it will increase the buying power of the poor through inflation, it's also going to exacerbate inequality, because there's going to be some transfer of wealth from the poor to the rich. Then a very important aspect is the fact that majority of these poor South Africans and the middle class are heavily indebted. And when you are heavily indebted, as soon as the rates go up, immediately your cost of debt servicing goes up also. And I will just quote what the FNB recently put up from their assessment, that the middle class spends 80% of their income within the first 5 days, and the rest of the month, they live on 20% only. So this is the background in which we live. If you allow me, another issue that we need to carefully look at is what is driving the current inflation. Is it a traditional demand push? Is it that citizens have so much cash in their hands and they are running after few goods? The answer is no. The answer here is that we have imported inflation from the global economic conditions, which the Reserve Bank governor himself acknowledges. Then my call is that we should really apply monetary policy not as business as usual, just like any other policy, but we have to be careful. It appears to me that we are really copying the US rates as they move, then we move. But the first thing is that the US has a more broader mandate for its monetary policy, and it is doing so against an unemployment rate of 3.6%, and we are doing so in the midst of an unemployment rate of 35.3%, and that is when we look at a narrow definition.
Well, he was our guest, of course, yesterday evening. Now, today, Prof, as you heard there, I was taking issue with, among other things, the fact that there seemed to be lack of coordination, especially among those who are responsible for the fiscal side of things. And we do have our guest back. She's experiencing some load shedding. Pelisa, good evening. Thanks very much for your time.
Hi, good evening, Vuyo. Yes, it's true. I'm experiencing load shedding. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you now. I mean, this of course hit just as we were starting the show. Perhaps a good way to, in fact, start this conversation would be around that very same issue, the issue of load shedding. Because I don't know if you got a bit or all of what Professor Ngepa had to say. One, he felt that, the Governor Kganyago and company were a bit too aggressive for his liking. But I'm going to put that aside for now because I want to come back to it a little later. But another issue that the professor raised yesterday when we spoke to him on the back of that announcement by Governor Kganyago was that those who are in charge of or responsible for the fiscal side of things were not helping things either. And today at the Black Business Council conference, Finance Minister Enoch Godongwana spoke about the issue of Eskom, which, as we all know, is or remains a big problem, holding the economic back in so many ways. Take a listen to what the Finance Minister had to say there.
One of the weaknesses of our system for the past 14 years, we've been trying to fix Eskom, not to fix power to the grid. It's our own weakness. It's our own, I'm accepting that. Between 2019 and this year, we'll be spending about 230 billion rand on Eskom, and we're not seeing the outcomes and the results. There must be a change in how we do these things. So we've got to make these structural reforms and change how to do things.
The finance minister there speaking to people who are attending the Black Business Council a conference in Midrand Palace. Just what you made of that, especially coming as it does, the day after the monetary policy committee took that decision, which as I was saying earlier, Professor Ngepa felt was aggressive, but at the same time, Professor Ngepa also raising the fact that he feels that on the fiscal side of things, we aren't doing well there either, and the combination of these things spells disaster. So what's your thoughts?
Yes, no, I mean, I actually like his tone, by the way, because I think that it sends a message. And part of that message is that we can't continue with the current status quo. As we said earlier, I'm taking this call in the dark. Now, there might be many people who are actually taking this call in the dark, that is, whose life has actually been disrupted because of a load shedding. And I agree with the sentiments, by the way, by the professor who interacted with you yesterday. Because the central question he is raising is that in whose interest are we actually raising interest rates? So let me start from the fiscal side, which was your basic question. So the key issue is that currently one of the key issues, you can see that how the monetary authorities are actually being aggressive in increasing or are managing the monetary policy are actually not in tangent with what the fiscal policy seeks to achieve. So, for instance, amongst the key things is that the Minister of Finance would have said in his budget speech, I suppose even today, that he wants to build a stable economy. So how do you build a stable economy when when investors are confronted with increased interest rate? In fact, by the way, in economic theory, we know that there's an inverse relationship between interest rate and investment. So it's quite clear that people are going to start, investors are going to start keeping some of their money. That's the first issue. I think the second issue is that you're not likely to attract either your brownfields or greenfields investment. The third issue, it's around the household spending on durable goods, and even though it might seem to be quite attractive for investors. And one of the key issues where you find a misnomer, which I think Professor again raises quite sharply, is the dual mandate of the Federal Reserve of U.S. America, which is, one of our biggest economies. Amongst the key things they do, they have two responsibilities. One is price stability. The second one is maximum sustainable employment. We have, as a country with 35.5% unemployment, we have a singular mandate, which really looks at price stability and as price stability as well as just balanced sustainable economic growth. Now, that sustainable economic growth could be anything, right? So the key issue is that we will see a lot of investors, coming through to come into our markets to come and invest because we have high interest rates. But in fact, we're squeezing the economy. I think the third element, which is implicit in his statement, which I agree with it, is our industrial policy, by the way, is that, in fact, amongst the key things that we actually need to do, we really need to shift our resources towards the industrial policy to support, because you can't be sitting with 46.8% and 77.9% of young people who are disengaged, Black women, 55.8% who are disengaged, who lead unproductive lives. And we still see this thing. Now, I know the argument of people who support monetary policy, the current singular mandate, would then argue that it's important to look at price stability. One of the worries about inflation targeting is that more often than not, you're chasing a shadow. It's a moving target. And I understand part of the arguments that the Central Bank Committee or MPC would have argued was that they would say, we've seen increase in terms of energy commodity and as well as food security. And that's why we're actually increasing inflation rate.
Okay.
So the reality...
Yes, continue. Finish your point.
So the reality that we're confronted with is that we actually need to deal with things that we have control with, that's where the point that is making that both fiscal and industrial planning in this country is not helping also the central bank. We have control around dealing with food security. Why are we not planting in this country and making sure that we become food secure country? Because currently we are nationally food secure country, but most of the food that we produce for this country actually goes off into the international market and leaves South Africans hungrier and even much more poor.
Okay. Now just on a couple of issues. As I was saying earlier, in my introduction, on the back of Professor Ngepa's comments yesterday, we felt let's track the people who are responsible for those areas that deal with of our economy, that deal with our fiscal policy. And interestingly, the Minister of Public Enterprises had his budget vote tabled in Parliament today. So there was a whole debate. And he made comments as though he was actually answering some of the questions about what are we doing. I mean, everyone knows the big problems of your money and of, that bedevil or continue to bedevil Eskom. But what is agitating a lot of people are these blackouts, that come willy-nilly, and that are really, disturbing, and there's no way of even planning for them. And he seemed to be speaking to that yesterday during his budget vote speech. Take a listen to what Pravin Gordhan had to say in Parliament today around Eskom and what they are trying to do to deal with this particular question.
Private sector, which will take various forms, from joint investments with the private sector to solving challenges and problems at a day-to-day level, and to proactive collaboration. In respect of the latter, Minister Patel and I have agreed that in view of the energy and logistics issues being vital to the success of our industrial efforts, we will launch a forum in which industrialists in key sectors, together with Eskom, Transnet, and other entities, will enhance collaboration, advance planning, and problem solving, and this will enable a better climate for investment and job creation. We are both making this announcement in our respective budget votes, which are taking place at the same time today.
All of you caught that, Pele. So together with the minister responsible for our industrial policy, they have decided to go out there to the private sector and say, you guys come and assist everything from thinking about how we deal with these problems, from Eskom to a whole host of other areas, but also how do we work together? Does it signal a change to you that finally, they are realizing that perhaps they aren't able on their own to actually deal with most of these issues, and they desperately need help?
Yes. For me, what is actually quite disturbing, by the way, is that what they are presenting today in the budget speech are actually are not new ideas. As early as 2013, 2014, 2015, Gauteng, for example, province had exactly such a similar industrial forum, but it never enjoyed political support. And I do think that sometimes the slow pace and the response of politicians really is actually hamstringing this country and trapping progress of a lot of citizens. But the sentiments are quite positive, and I think, I do think that we've had even a similar initiative in the form of a PICC, Presidential Infrastructure Committee. And by design, that committee was always, again, meant to extract maximum value in as far as industrialization, but also at the same time coordinate the economy. Now, we had a break because of some of the differences amongst the politicians. I do think that the sentiments are positive, but I also think that there's already an industrial development strategy that's existing in this country that is actually, gathering dust. That's the first issue. I think the second issue is that we've had what you call sectoral plans that already, industrial plans that already the Department of DTIC is actually dealing with. The key issue which the ministers are not pinning down, and for me, I am so nervous because it means that they will enter into a terrain where they are actually going to be told by the private sector what needs to be done. Because the role of government in the state is to guide business where it invests, but also identify strategic sectors. So what makes me nervous is the fact that with the by now, both ministers should have said, in this country, we are actually losing industrial capacity. We think these are the sectors we want to go into. But also at the same time, they should also be saying the sectors that are able to introduce beneficiation, which is, I think that's a point I was talking about with you some time ago, around the structural change at a micro level. The sectors that are able to make changes. I think I want to make the point, to continue with the point around the steel industry, for instance, that the steel industry, there is minimal beneficiation. That sector is highly dominated by family-owned business, which is actually excellent because that's a culture we should be actually promoting in South Africa, is that as family-owned business and SMM is women-owned businesses. But at the heart of this approach, what also even makes me nervous is that it's likely to exclude women-owned businesses, right? Who in fact might have ideas but may not have support from a product development, might not have all the factors of production, which has really always been the issue, a structural issue in this country. So, I mean, the sentiments are good, but in fact, 27 years or 28 years into a constitutional democracy, we would really like ministers in the economic cluster which are succinctly saying, this is what we want to resolve. These are the challenges, and this is so much we're putting up in the market, which in this context, that's where then the Reserve Bank needs to come in as a partner to make it sure that it encourages investment and that, but it doesn't take such an aggressive stance of increasing interest rate by 50 basis points. I mean, for me, for instance, if you think about, the middle class, black middle class, particularly in this country, which is actually, trapped in debt, you should see our indebtedness. I mean, most of us today have been getting notices from the bank saying we're increasing interest rate. Now, you can imagine how that is actually going to create a leakage in terms of spending at a household level, but also black families who are connected to rural communities and townships who feed between 5 to 12 people within their own balance sheet are actually going to be much more poorer. So, and that's why, for me, I actually agree that you can see that there is no economic coordination. Positive sentiments are actually not sufficient when you're sitting with 46% of your citizens in social grants. We need to move, and we need to move very fast. Now, the call for industrialists to come into the table is actually highly appreciable. But of course, we do know that a lot of black people, a lot of black women don't have a lot of money for even many industrial companies because none of them have actually inherited anything from their parents. All they have inherited is citizenship. So in essence, we must truly actually really make it sure that this industrial intervention and this coordination from ministers has massive transformative outcome in a much more fundamental way than we've seen it over the years.
Well, I mean, take a listen to the minister responsible for trade, industry and competition, highlighting some of the details, of his plans for the year ahead.
I want to highlight instead the details of our plans for the year ahead, which turn the de-risking strategy that I've outlined to this House today into reality. To fuel the economic recovery and deepen industrialization, the DTIC entities together will offer 22 billion rand in customized support packages to companies over the next 12 months. This will be complemented by strategic support to deepen implementation of our master plans, including the launch of the new 400 million rand furniture growth fund in partnership with manufacturers and retailers. To support our localization efforts, we will aim to achieve a 40 billion rand increase in the production of targeted local industrial output, which brings us closer to our 5-year target of 200 billion rand. Our investment facilitation and promotion activities will aim to unlock at least 120 billion rand in investment from the private sector in the next 12 months. Last year, I outlined the first steps we will take to embrace the opportunities in green industrialization through the green hydrogen and electric vehicle roadmaps. We have made considerable progress in researching practical options, costing them, identifying possible funding, publishing a draft green paper, and receiving feedback from stakeholders. We will now table our draft green hydrogen commercialization strategy in Cabinet for consideration and guidance by the end of August, and our electric vehicles roadmap by the end of October.
Well, I mean, Professor, I mean, he said a lot of other things, you know, after that. But in the interest of, because we've run out of time, I can't play as much of that clip as I would have wanted. But from the little you've been able to hear up to the point where he stopped, does it sound like he's on the money? They've got this, and.
Well, he's not in the money because it's actually a repetition of several things we've heard over the years. Firstly, the basic issue that the minister needs to address is the decentralization of industrial activities in this country to reduce the pressure from Gauteng, from Western Cape and KZN. That's the first issue. And he needs to do that in partnership, for example, with the Minister of Agriculture, for example, and obviously with the support of from the Minister of Finance, and as well as other ministers. So, for instance, I mean, I don't know if you if you saw the competition report that really looks on concentration of markets in this country. My biggest fear, again, is that people are going to be chewing up and cashing in on that 22 billion he's announcing, is that it's those that will continue to cash the state. For me, I mean, the issue around deepening industrialization, localization, etc. Firstly, he's also sitting with the issues around Black economic empowerment policy regime. Did you know, for example, that in the Black economic policy regime is that firms are not, there are no punitive measures imposed when they don't comply, but there are punitive measures that are imposed when they are fronting. Can you see that contradiction already? That's the first issue. So it means that from a localization perspective, there's very little that is likely to achieve. I accept that in economics or in building a vibrant economy, there's always opportunity cost. But we've been doing too much economic opportunity cost at the expense of citizens. So he needs to start taking that money and reviving some of the nodes that were actually existing pre the constitutional democratic dispensation, to allow those people to actually start, to allow those communities, the rural communities, Onumtata, in Butterworth, in the former Fiscal, in Guyani, etc., to start working. The second component that the minister needs to really do is to make it sure that he tightens up these policy loopholes so that we are clear about exactly around the BEE. And the third issue around localization. Localization has to come, the economy has to pay a premium for industrialization. As long as we're not willing to pay that premium, there needs to be an investment on local industrialists. And part of it is that you need to embed what we call learning by doing. Allow citizens to make mistakes, as long as, for example, our budgetary system is so actually risk averse in a country that has a history of economic discrimination and separate development. You know, it feels like sometimes all of us were equals, and we actually have never been equals. And that's why we continue to have, for example, such high indebtedness, so many Black people, for example, that have to carry so many people within their own balance sheet. And in essence, because it actually means that it's the fiscal policy, it's the macroeconomic policy that needs to do several interventions. I don't even want to talk about tax. I don't think tonight is actually a conversation about even including tax. I'll confuse the listeners. But the key issue, though, is that the minister is still speaking next to the money, and it means that as well as there is no recognition that this country has to become, an active. We need to really revive the, towns, small towns who have been left, dead without any economic activities. We need to revive mining towns who are linked to economy. So I'm not hearing that, and I know, of course, you didn't play a lot of the speech, but I would have heard him, talking more specific, because he speaks like the president. It's the president who needs to give high-level reflection. Okay. But the ministers must say, with the 22 billion, we're allocating 3% to this sector. We're allocating 3%. I hear about the furniture sector. I think that's important. Textile sector is one of the most important sectors as well in this country, because it's linked to agricultural sector, by the way, because it starts from a planting of a cotton, and there's an investment that, the investment that the DTIC has made in the cotton sector, but there is a bit of coordination that needs to, take place. So automotive sector becomes the most crucial sector because it's linked to 18 sectors of the economy. We need to see a lot more specifics, not generic, statements to appease the market.
Okay. We're going to leave it there for this evening, Pelisa. Thank you very much for your time. Pelisa Nkomo, who's a development economist, but also she's the chairperson of Oxfam, on the back, of course, of that 50 basis point rate hike announced yesterday by the Reserve Bank governor, but also the Reserve Bank governor giving an indication that there is more to come. Of course, on the program, we are going to continue to monitor these events, but also on the fiscal side of things, monitoring what people are doing there. After the break, with a few days left before the continent commemorates the 20th birthday of the African Union, the Thabo Mbeki Foundation, whose patron hosted and presided over that Durban launch 20 years ago, looks at the state of the continent.
The Thabo Mbeki African School of Public and International Affairs, a joint initiative of the University of South Africa and the Thabo Mbeki Foundation, will on May 27 this year, 2022, host the 12th annual Thabo Mbeki Africa Day Lecture. The lecture will be themed The African Union at 20 to mark the 20th anniversary of the AU.
Thabo Mbeki Foundation patron, Thabo Mbeki, they're talking about what they are planning to do next week. And this morning, his foundation, together with his partners, they had a briefing where they talk journalists through some of their thoughts, their assessment of where things are, but also their hope for the future. And all of this, of course, going back 20 years. I mean, I still remember that conference in Durban where the African Union was launched. President Thabo Mbeki was, of course, the president of the country at the time. The question we're asking tonight is the AU living up to its lofty ambitions? My guests are Thabo Mbeki Foundation Chairperson Geraldine Mlegedi and UNISA's Professor Darlene Miller. Good evening to both of you, and thank you so much for your time.
Thank you. Pleasure. Happy to be here.
Of course, I mean, a lot was said and built around, the why we had as a continent to move from the Organization of African Union to the African Union. A fresh start was the biggest thing that was touted. I mean, 20 years on, are we leaving up to what the AU was thought to be, everyone thought the AU would deliver, Geraldine?
So
Maybe I'll start with quite a provocative quote that Professor Falula made when he said that Africa has been suffering from a leadership deficit, certainly at a cancerous rate, more than its trade deficit. He said few still exist that beacon the impeccable character that make up of the African personality. But he felt a solution has arrived through the school itself, and I'm sure Prof. Miller will speak about the school quite a bit. So coming back to your question as to whether the African Union has lived up to its lofty ambitions, very clearly, I think this is one thing that Professor Falula will talk about. But I think as we look at Agenda 2063 and we look at what the scorecard says on that, and there's been a second continental progress report that's been remarkably candid. And that report actually reflects that we've not done so well. You know, if we look 20 years ago, at that point, we experienced conflicts and coups on the continent. We also had the beating of drums internationally at that point. Quite ironically, those war drums are not only beating, but we've seen that reality as we looked at not only Europe, but you look at Yemen, you look at Ethiopia, and so on. So specifically, as it relates to the economic development on the continent, I think that there's a lot to be said on this. But we're talking about 54 countries. It's a checkered scorecard. We have a situation, for example, if we look at infrastructure development, that you have Trans-African highway priority projects under Program for Infrastructure Development, and in certain areas such as the highway that's there from Lagos to Mombasa, Kenya has done very well. But when you look at other areas, you talk about only 70% of progress on that. So no, we've not really lived up to the lofty ideals. We've not done so from a leadership perspective to the extent required. And even when we've looked at Agenda 2063, not done as well as we should.
Professor Miller, from your vantage point?
Thanks so much. You know, just listening to the previous part of your debate, I think South Africans must be feeling so uneasy and so worried about their futures on so many different fronts. We find that our livelihoods and our lives are assailed. There's tremendous insecurity and vulnerability in this country. And somehow, when we listen to a discussion about so many billions will be put to support this program, so many billions will be put to support that program, your previous speaker, the Oxfam chair, spoke about how those programs don't reach people who actually need them. So we are facing a tremendous crisis in our country, and we are facing a crisis on our continent. And in the middle of this, we say, come and celebrate Africa Day. Let us have a celebration. This seems at variance with what the people of our country are going through. And Geraldine Fraser has raised Professor Falola's contribution that he made, where he said, no, our biggest problem is not a trade deficit. Our biggest problem is a leadership deficit. And this is what the Thabo Mbeki African School of Public and International Affairs would like to address. We would like to address this matter of the leadership deficit. And we have particular ideas and approaches on this. But when Pelisa says these are not new ideas, she's flagging the need for new ideas to come to the help of every citizen. We cannot leave our citizens in as vulnerable state as they are. What then are we as the school proposing? That is what I hope we will come back to in our discussion as we proceed.
Briefly take us through just some of the thoughts, ideas that you are putting on the table, Prof.
Can you repeat your question? Sorry,
I'm saying take us through some of the thoughts, ideas that you are putting on the table on this issue of leadership.
One of the major foci of the school is transdisciplinary knowledge. Transdisciplinary knowledge is an idea. It's about books and papers and people with numbers and people with particular approaches to social problems. So the South African citizen might well say, well, what are you going to give us? I can't eat your ideas, Professor Miller. This is not going to solve my problem next week. When we speak about new ideas, there's some kind of reflection that we need about what Prof. Falola has called the African personality. Because when the African Union was formed, there were particular kinds of personalities that came together. We had very, very sterling African leaders in the 1960s, and they did something similar to America. America did it under Roosevelt. They said, let's have a huge plan for this entire geographic area. Let's have a huge plan for the whole of the continent. And they called it the Lagos Plan of Action. And they were passionate and they were impassioned about what they are doing. We've had subsequent successive plans of action. But in fact, we're falling short every time our plans of action seem to not take us to a better future for Africans. What we are then saying is that there's one critical element here, and that is the element of leadership. We've had many discussions, many institutes, but we have to reinterrogate African personhood and the African character and the African personality. And there are intellectuals and African intellectuals that are beginning to write about this idea. So on the one hand, the idea of African personhood, revisiting that, what does that mean? Because clearly there must be a relationship between our policies and the difficulties that we encounter when we go to a government office. Who are the people? Who are the persons, the African persons that are standing behind a counter at Home Affairs and turning us away when we are desperate? How are our ideas interrogating the ethics of that leadership, of that public leadership? At the international level, I raised the point about transdisciplinary knowledge. Now, there's an important contribution made by an organization, a research institution called the International Science Council. And the Science Council has got a document that says it's called the Transformative Cornerstones. And it says you cannot approach knowledge by these silos: a sociologist, a biologist, an agriculturalist, that you have to have with the key global problems that we are facing. You have to have some kind of conversation, cooperation. You need to have these different disciplines speaking to each other at the point of research design, at the point of research output. So this is one of the new ideas that we at the Thabo Mbeki African School of Public and International Affairs would love to introduce to our students and into the world of African knowledge as well. It's not a new idea, but universities have struggled to implement them. We believe we can.
Okay. Now, I've had both of you, on the a big question of leadership, and as you have just said, Prof, what you are busy doing to try and address that. But I want to talk about policy, which is an area you touched on. And among the key policy advances we are told have been made over the years is the coming up with the African continental free trade agreement, which has been touted as a significant breakthrough that, if implemented, is really going to change things for the better and hopefully forever. Just your thoughts on the ground that has been covered up until now, Geraldine.
Yeah, on the African, let me first start out with the earlier point. And I do want to say being self-critical about where we are at the moment should not be seen as a pessimistic outlook. And it shouldn't be interpreted as giving up on anything. So I just want to state that. I think there is a need to be self-critical, and whether we're academics, politicians, or ordinary citizens, we should look at the scorecard and say, much as we recognize this 20th anniversary, the African Union at 20, we look at it with a lens of where it should be and not only where it is. And I state this because when you look at a country like Togo, for example, I mean, unlike many other countries, the figures we have is that in Togo, unemployment has significantly reduced from 6.4% in 2014 to 2.6% in 2019. That's a good news story, and I thought I should place it there. When we come to the Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement, this is also a large initiative that was started to look at improving both economic and social integration on the continent. The intention was to kick off with it in 2020, but that didn't happen, and this was large in part due to COVID and the COVID pandemic that had quite a massive impact across African countries, South Africa included. So in 2021, January, it was really when it started taking off. We need to look a lot more closely, I think specifically at South Africa as well, around our engagement and involvement with this, because this is an opportunity to ensure that we contribute towards integrated economic growth on the continent, as I have stated earlier, and in terms of the importance thereof. So I just want to pause on that. So the initiative has started. I think that there's a lot more that needs to be done. Yeah.
Now, Prof, you know, when former President Thabo Mbeki delivered his speech at the launch of the African Union in Durban, he spoke, of course, about solidarity, social cohesion, unity among Africans, and so on, and spoke to the kinds of partnerships that the African Free Trade Agreement speaks to. But one of the things he also underscored was a recognition that there can be no meaningful dialogue, unity, there can be no economic development if on the continent we don't silence guns, if we don't end coups. And as you're saying, Geraldine, right at the beginning, we've seen, no less than 3 coups, in the past a couple of years. Why do you think we've gone backwards, as some people are suggesting, on that front?
Well, I think we will go back to the comment by Prof. Falula around the leadership challenges that we have on the continent. And to a large degree, there's also a need to look at the role of the African Union in to prevent coups from taking place. I think our intervention should be there much earlier. And there is the organ that looks at the whole issue of peace and security, a very critical organ as well. And this reflects to a challenge around diversity and lack of tolerance of diversity, because I think whether we look at Ethiopia right now and the conflict that's in Ethiopia, or whether we are looking at Mali or Burkina Faso, very clearly the continent needs to, and the Union needs to look very closely at how it is dealing with these issues and whether the commitments that have been made by the heads of state have actually been followed through. Because at the end of the day, the Constitutive Act was adopted by all members of the Union. And I think one of the challenges that we see is not only the question of policy development and commitment or what is spelled out in the Constitutive Act, but actually following that through with implementation. And there is a mechanism that's there on that's utilized by the African Union, and that's the African peer review mechanism, where peers, heads of state who have voluntarily subjected themselves to reviews are able to sit down and should quite critically engage on why there are specific challenges in different regions of the continental countries. And we know that these are complex. So it's not a straightforward issue, and I don't want to oversimplify it. We also know that there are, in many instances, exogenous factors that also contributes towards the conflict on the continent and in countries. But that's why we need to ensure, as a union, that we find African solutions to these problems, and we do so in a manner where we are bold enough to have both the vision as well as the will to implement.
Prof, but it's your thoughts here, because as Geraldine just said, I mean, the Constitutive Act of the AU did foresee, these kinds of things, and was quite. People were quite upfront about what it would mean to go back to, if we don't silence guns, if we don't end coups, that those phenomena stand in the way of, defeating poverty, developing the continent, ending diseases and so on. Why do you think we seem to be regressing, in spite of the fact that the Constitutive Act of the AU was quite strong on these matters?
Yeah. I just wanted to add, for the purpose of the viewers, we've been quoting both Geraldine and I from Professor Falola. And the reason we are quoting Professor Falola is because he is the keynote speaker at our Africa Day event next Friday evening. And a quick soundbite, if I may, you'll find the event for next Friday, 27 May, on the Thabo Mbeki School's social media platforms, our Facebook, our Instagram. The point I made at the start about why would we celebrate Africa at a time like this when, as you point out, we're facing major conflicts. We seem to be regressing in terms of the militaristic growth. We've seen the burgeoning security interest on the continent. And one of the reasons we are coming together is not simply to have a glittering event, and I would hope it's not too glittering, because we've had our citizens being very angry about 20 million rand being spent on the flag. So I hope that I trust that we will have more decorum in terms of how we come together. So the event will speak to some of these issues that you are raising. Professor Falola himself is someone, he's on our advisory board, but he certainly doesn't mince his word, and he does not mince his word. So let me just say to you what he says in relation to the states, because clearly states are key actors when these conflicts emerge. And he says that he was speaking when the school was launched in September 2020. He said, if modern states have been conditioned to support the bourgeoisie, right? Who is the bourgeoisie? What is this man saying? The bourgeoisie is speaking about the people in power, the people who control, the people who own. If the modern states have been conditioned to support the bourgeoisie at the detriment of the common people, the workers, the proletarians, the TM school wants to see how it could adjust extant colonial and neo-colonial curriculum design, extant meaning outdated, fitting with colonial pasts, regurgitated by several African institutions in response to solving this modern menace. So if we're going to begin to critique and question the way in which leadership has unfolded, there's some relationship then between the role of the state, the kinds of leaders, the kinds of values that are espoused, and as universities, often we entrench and reinforce these value systems rather than negating and disrupting those value systems. So President Mbeki himself at the same event, he spoke about corporate stooges. He says, but as universities, we cannot be generating corporate stooges. We cannot fall into that American system where we are counting beans, where our knowledge is like a mercantilist system, where we're reinforcing what Professor Lula said about an aggressive capitalist system, a planetary system that does not work, that turns the problems for people into externalities. So Mbeki says, the TM school will have to avoid the consequence so graphically described by Brian Williams of turning its students into corporate stooges. I'm not saying a university can be a panacea to a continent's problems. I'm definitely not saying that an Africa Day can do the same thing. But certainly we are there to interrogate some serious ideas and to have some hard-hitting critiques of the problems that we are facing. We cannot simply have continued support to big food monopolies, for example, when we are suffering with food prices and the crises that we have currently.
Okay. So we'll all, a lot of South Africans will look forward to that lecture. Of course, the SABC will bring you that lecture next week. Everyone looking forward to it. But that's all we're going to end it for tonight. A special thanks to the Thabo Mbeki Foundation Chairperson, Geraldine Mleketi, and UNISA's Professor Darlene Miller. That particular lecture next week will give you the details as time goes by. And that's our show for tonight and for this week. Do join us again on Monday, same time. Have a good night and a great weekend.